Good evening, everyone, or good morning if you're watching us from North America. I'd like to welcome everybody on another edition of the Heretics podcast on Voten TV. I hope everybody had a great Christmas, and I hope the start of your new year has been a good one. Today, we have a chance to host once again Douglas McGregor on our podcast, and we will discuss the situation in Ukraine, obviously, and other geopolitical topics of relevance. Doug, it's a pleasure to welcome you again on Voten TV.
Good.
Doug, I want to start with a general question about the battlefield situation currently that we're dealing with in Ukraine, because a lot has changed since our last interview. So what's your take on where things are going in terms of the broad military situation in eastern Ukraine?
Well, I think we focus a little bit in the south first, and keep in mind that the Ukrainians constructed what amounts to, in the view of some analysts, 3 lines of defense in depth facing the Russians in the enclave that the Russians currently control. Those lines of defense seem to be largely crumbling, and the Ukrainians have taken the Russian bait, launched endless counterattacks, and just about bled themselves to death trying to throw the Russians out, which of course they cannot do. And I think what was just happened south of Zaporizhia is instructive. If you look at that area, there's a defensive line. It's not really a very substantial defense by any means, but it's a line about 50 kilometers long, stretching from the southwest to the northeast in front of Zaporizhia. The 15th Army, Russian forces advanced towards that area, encountered some resistance, but in the meantime, the Ukrainians seem to have rushed several thousand troops down there. And I've heard some people say 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, we don't know. But if we look at how the Russians have handled this, I think it tells us a great deal about what we're likely to see in the future, and that is that Ukrainians have shown up with infantry. They have no armored platforms down there whatsoever. And so they end up putting these infantrymen into battle positions around which presumably the Russians can swirl at some point. But the Russians look at this and their view is, at the moment, they're not doing anything. They're letting these people set up. They could care less because the light infantry there is not a high-value target. They can brush through that when they need to. But what they plan to do, and what we're seeing increasingly, is that they'll look for any air defense systems that they can find. They send in drones with warheads to destroy those, particularly the radars, first and foremost. Once the radars are gone, the air defense systems aren't very useful. They'll use loitering munitions. And if they've stripped away all of the air defense systems and they've eliminated most of the tanks and artillery systems, then they'll move forward and finish off everything on the ground with direct fire. Ukrainians don't have much artillery. They don't have much in the way of armor. And, talking about bringing in tanks, if you look at the sum total that are being promised sometime in the next 6 to 12 months, 81, I think you said 81 tanks, British, American, and German. What will 81 tanks do across 50 kilometers against the 15th Army? The answer is not a whole hell of a lot, especially since most of them will probably be neutralized or destroyed long before the 15th Army closes with them. So this is a different way of war. This is this framework where you're a complex, if you will, where you link all of the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms in space and above the battlefield and the terrestrial arena with all the strike systems at your disposal. The Russians have gotten quite good at this. They provide very accurate data to all of their artillery systems. And that's why 75% of all the Ukrainian casualties taken in this war have been inflicted with standoff attack, strike artillery systems. I think that's where the war is headed. We're sitting around now where the Russians have the initiative. It looks like they're getting out of Bakhmut, which makes sense. The Russians have left a road open. Now they can sweep it with artillery, but they'll lose fewer people leaving than they will by staying, obviously. So I think at some point this line is going to simply crumble, and they'll start moving north and northwest. And it's anybody's guess when the Russians decide to launch their offensives.
Do you expect the offensive to take on the character of somewhat of a Russian blitzkrieg, or will they just, in your opinion, intensify the meat grinding that's taking place with the additional troops that have been mobilized?
You know, one of the things that's impressed me about the Russian commanders is their concern for their soldiers. I mean, that's why a lot of these comparisons with the Soviet Union are just outrageous nonsense, especially when people try to characterize the behavior of the Russian soldiers as like those of the Soviet troops. Nothing could be further from the truth. And as a result, there is a preference for the methodical grinder, as you point out. It will be accelerated, and in some areas they will move faster than others. But as a general rule, I think this methodical meat grinder will start moving in the east first. If you look at the concentration of Russian forces in and around Belgrade and down in the south, and I don't know which avenue, maybe they'll use 2 or 3 avenues coming out of the south. I mean, they could go up through Zaporozhye or further north, closer to the Oxal River, wherever they go. But it'll be a very methodical approach because they simply don't want to waste Russian lives. And I sometimes get the impression the Russians are willing to let a lot of these Ukrainians go. I know that sounds strange, but one of the reports that came in from the 15th Army was that they encountered large numbers of Ukrainian troops that after a short firefight basically tossed their weapons and left. But the Russians pointed out that's understandable because these are people that have been forced to fight, recently dragooned into the army. They're given a few NCOs or officers. As soon as the fighting gets hot, the NCOs and officers leave, and the soldiers are on their own, and they say, well, why should we sit here and become meat for the grinder? I think we're going to see more of that, and we're also seeing a very intensified campaign behind the lines by the SBU, from Kherson all the way to Kiev and all the way out to Transcarpathia, where they're trying to round up Hungarians. You can imagine how excited the Hungarians in Western Ukraine are about fighting the Russians in Eastern Ukraine. This is a tragedy. It's a disaster. It is the worst thing that I think we've seen since the Second World War. At least in the Second World War, there were some reasons to fight. This time, this is just stupid. It's a waste of human capital.
Just staying with the Eastern Front, the reports that are coming from the Western press, and I've seen this in the Washington Post, is that the Ukrainians have conducted an orderly evacuation from Bakhmut. Now, from what I saw, it was anything but orderly. They were just being killed and they were running away from Bakhmut. So who's right here?
Well, we're going to try to put a happy face on the dead rat whenever we're able to do so. And that's what the Ukrainian cause is. It's a dead rat. You listen to Zelensky and his spinmeisters talk, and they're on another planet. So I don't place much value in anything that comes through the mainstream Western press. Figure that these are concocted narratives that are then spewed out ad nauseum. I think the truth is more along the lines that you've said. And Ukrainians sent back messages that were translated, provided to me, saying, we're better off leaving and taking the casualties, getting out, however the hell we can get out, than sitting here and being annihilated. And that's been the argument for how many weeks? And apparently Zelensky would not give them permission to withdraw. Again, this is, in his mind, all about politics and the criticality of maintaining the facade of some degree of order and capability so that people will ship more money to them and equipment.
Well, sound military advice from a sound military leader such as Zelensky. Doug, I want to transfer a bit to the results of that famous Ramstein meeting that took place. You are very familiar with armored warfare. I don't think I have to tell my audience about your bio. You took part in the Battle of 73 Easting. You were there. You saw it. So how would you assess the following words, knowing how many tanks the United Kingdom, Poland, the United States now, as it was announced yesterday by Biden, these are the words of Ben Wallace when he addressed the British Parliament just after the Ramstein meeting. I quote, "The international community recognizes that equipping Ukraine to push Russia out of its territory is as important as equipping them to defend what they already have. Today's package is an important increase in Ukraine's capabilities. it means they can go from resisting to expelling the Russian forces from Ukrainian soil. So, Doug, will those tanks expel the Russians from Ukrainian soil? Why or why not?
Well, how do I put this? I have to give this some careful consideration. No, nothing like it in the world. The warfare that we're seeing now guarantees with almost perfect certainty that more than half of those tanks will be destroyed long before they manage to close with the Russians. The other thing is, we can talk all you want about the amount of training time and maintenance infrastructure and logistical problems, those things. We don't need to go all over that. Everybody's covered it. But the truth is, if you got them into an area, how would you integrate them into your existing units? Because that's what's most important. You're not going to take 50 or 100 tanks, as was done during the Second World War by the Russians, for instance, on more than one occasion, mass them and then throw them at the enemy, because they're simply going to be destroyed quickly. No, they have to be integrated within your existing force. They have to have air defense. They have to have air and missile defense. If you cannot shoot down these drones that are being directed at you with precision guidance, you're just going to sit there and watch these tanks evaporate, vanish in a hail of gunfire. So I don't see this happening at all. I don't see anybody ejecting anyone from anywhere. I've listened to lots of fanciful statements recently about, potential for us to intervene, which I think is of sheer lunacy in the West. We're not organized properly to deal with this kind of warfare either. 75% of all the casualties inflicted on the Ukrainians have come from artillery systems. When I say artillery, I'm not just talking about the sort of standard hard shell and mortar rounds. I'm talking about rockets, tactical ballistic missiles, all of those things. 75%. And the Russians can fire about up to 60,000 rounds a day. That includes rockets and missiles. The Ukrainians on their best day are lucky if they can get off 6,500. You cannot win in this kind of static battlefield environment that way. The Ukrainians can't maneuver in it. If you can't maneuver it, then you're thrown back on attrition. And attrition is a bad way to fight. And right now, the Russians have the upper hand with strike. And even though we are providing the ISR and brilliant information on the Russians to the Ukrainians, they can't really exploit it because they can't get out from under the strike threat. So the short answer is, I think the man is delusional. But he's a light infantryman. Right. He probably believes that these poor bastards are going to survive and win. It doesn't work out that way.
Like, what do you make of the reports that William Burns, who was in Kiev, William Burns obviously being the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, he was in Kiev on an unannounced visit recently, and apparently that's what the Western press is reporting from unnamed sources. He told Zelensky that after July, it might get hard to get equipment from the West, especially from the States. What are you seeing in Washington? Are the Republicans really seriously approaching the question of, hey, not only should we audit what we already sent, but we should, end what we're planning to send? What's your take?
It's mixed. Remember that, like most people's governments, we have the best government money can buy. And large numbers of people on the Hill benefit enormously in terms of campaign contributions from doing the bidding of their donors. Those donors want war with Russia. They think that harming Russia is a good thing and that somehow or another we benefit from it. I obviously think that's nonsense and don't support it, but that's the feeling. And I don't see that ebbing dramatically. Now, he said by July. Well, maybe that's true. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm not even sure that the Kiev regime and this state called Ukraine will be around by July. I just don't know. I think Burns is also been trying to tell them to do things differently on the ground, as have many of our military advisors. And they have not, or only taken some of the advice and not most of it. It's a very hard-headed group, I mean, Ukrainians are tough people, and I understand what they're trying to do. Unfortunately, I think it's a bad cause in the wrong